Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Teneo Insights Quick Take. I'm Kevin Kajiwara coming to you from outside New York today. Early this morning, Friday, June the 13th, Israel launched a series of strikes against Iranian nuclear and military facilities and military and nuclear personnel. Here to describe the events today and what to expect going forward, I'm joined by two colleagues. Dennis Ross is the senior advisor at our strategic partner firm, WestExec Advisors. He is also associated with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He is a longtime and key negotiator for the United States in the Middle East, representing the U.S. in both the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations, and he was on the National Security Council staffs of both President Reagan and President Obama. In addition, I'm joined by my colleague, Emily Stromquist, herself just back from a trip in the Middle East. She is the head of Teneo's political risk advisory business in Washington and also one of the leaders of our Middle East coverage. Thank you both for joining us today. Let's just start with what has happened. What was targeted by Israel? Do we have a sense of how successful they have been thus far, both in terms of the physical infrastructure as well as some of the targeted individuals? Maybe Emily, you can give us a really quick rundown on that.
Sure, happy to. So, as Israel has dubbed this, Operation Rising Lion happened overnight. They used over 200 fighter jet drones inside of Iran as well to strike more than 100 targets. This was largely targeting IRGC, top IRGC brass nuclear sites. The IRGC chief Hossein Salami, who's considered one of the most powerful figures in Iran, was one of these targets, along with several other IRGC commanders and also nuclear scientists. In addition, they did manage to strike the Natanz underground uranium enrichment sites. I think importantly, Netanyahu has vowed that this will take as long as it takes. That doesn't necessarily indicate to us too much about sort of the end game here with Israel. Iran retaliated almost immediately with 100 drones, which were intercepted outside of Israel. I don't think that we should take that as the official Iranian retaliation. Certainly with so much of their kind of chief IRGC staff targeted, they will need time to regroup. So I would expect more on that front. But, I think where we're at right now, this was certainly a significant escalation in events.
So Dennis, I'm interested to know your thoughts in terms of why this happened today. I know we've got, there's been a lot of talk in recent days about the IAEA report, about the sort of, haven't really accomplished anything on the U.S.-Iran negotiations. Netanyahu has been under domestic pressure, of course, as well. But why did this occur this morning? Why not, next week, or why not last week? I know there are upcoming negotiations that were planned between the U.S. and Iran for this coming weekend. Where do those stand? But perhaps before you get to that, you are on the ground in Israel this morning. So tell us what you're seeing and hearing there at the moment, but then perhaps to that bigger question.
All right, so I'm in Jerusalem right now. I was in Tel Aviv last night when this took place. Everything is remarkably quiet here right now. If you didn't know what had happened, you wouldn't know anything was happening. Obviously, that kind of quiet can be very deceiving. I completely agree with what Emily said. The disruption of the Iranian high command, both the military and the IRGC, I count at least 15 high-ranking officers, including Navy, missile forces, have been killed. Command control has been completely disrupted. I would be really surprised if there wasn't also some sort of massive Israeli cyber attack at the same time. So I think the Iranians are in a state of shock. They could fire drones. The Israelis were also hitting a lot of the ballistic missile launch sites. I fully expect the Iranians will regroup. I also fully expect that they will launch some large barrage of ballistic missiles at some point. And that will, I think, take us in a direction of how this will go, how effective the Israelis are in stopping it, how much of a reserve the Iranians have. That will likely determine the length of time. Emily's point of quoting the Prime Minister that it takes as long as it takes, that gives him maximum flexibility to keep it going or to declare success. My impression is he right now thinks they have been enormously successful in terms of what they set out to do. The measure ultimately is what did it really do to the nature of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure? And what is it doing to the Iranian regime? If it proves that they have a hard time retaliating, that also tells us something about the state of the Iranian regime. And that's something that bears watching. But I said my anticipation is we will see them regroup. Why now? Great question. I will give you uh, my explanation. The Israelis are saying quietly that their intel determined that the supreme leader had made a decision finally to go ahead with a nuclear weapon, number one. They apparently picked this up recently. Number two, the Natanz, they hit the underground facility in Natanz. The Iranians have been developing a much deeper underground facility that would actually be even beyond the reach of the massive ordnance penetrator that we have, the Israelis don't have. And this is a move to try to preempt their ability to create what could be an invulnerable site. I think third reason was this is day 61. You'll recall that President Trump said he was giving the Iranians 2 months. Maybe in his conversations with Netanyahu, he said, you can't strike as long as we're talking. And Bibi undoubtedly would say, well, the Iranians will talk forever. And he said 2 months. And I'm not sure there was an understanding there. But you can count on the fact that when you ask the question, will these negotiations go ahead? The answer is not right now. The Iranians, given a conspiratorial mind, and even if you don't have a conspiratorial mind, would assume that the Witkoff mission for this weekend was a ruse to convince them that nothing was going to happen precisely because there were negotiations underway. And Trump has been very clear he wanted to give the negotiations a chance. So I think you have some interesting mix of these factors. Netanyahu probably felt he had enough of a green light, but with the understanding that Israel was doing this on its own. President's come out and said, we support Israel, not seeing any movement of forces, not seeing any sort of buildup. The American capability right now to help Israel with interceptions exists in the context of Central Command, but there's been a reduction in our capability. So we don't have a presence that we had during the Biden time, where there was much more of an active American role in terms of interceptions. That would be an interesting indicator to watch as well about where this may be going, what the U.S. might be doing to try to head off escalation.
You know, Dennis, in many of the administration's kind of foreign policy initiatives right now, there is always this talk of their kind of effort to escalate to de-escalate, essentially. Right now, I understand that the moment things go kinetic, it's very hard to guide the narrative at that point. But do you think this point of devastating, military strikes by Israel on personnel and on physical assets, notwithstanding whether they will be able to get to the deep underground stuff at Fort Al and Isfahan and others, but nonetheless, devastating attack. We have seen twice in the last year the impotence of Iran's retaliatory capabilities, particularly now that their proxies are also degraded throughout the region. Does this apply pressure, in your view, despite the political disarray you just mentioned in Iran, probably as a result of this? Does this incent them to come back to the negotiating table in a serious way, even if the negotiations scheduled for this weekend may be put further off?
I think you've captured President Trump's mindset. He thinks if you put this kind of pressure, that others will realize that they have to see the light and they have to come around. You can see what he's saying in interviews today, where he's saying, hardliners on their side didn't want to do it, but they're dead now. So, let's talk. Let's bring this to an end. I think that's the last thing that the Supreme Leader will do at this point. It would be too much of an admission of defeat. It would be the kind of humiliation that in his eyes would threaten the survivability of the regime itself. Whether we think that's the way he should approach it or not, everything we know about him suggests that that's the way he will. So if nothing else, before they would return to negotiations, they would need to have something they could claim or point to as a success. So I don't think you're going to see an immediate end to this, and I don't think you'll see any early resumption of negotiations.
And so, as far as the retaliation is concerned, obviously they've had. I just mentioned what did not what they did not succeed with against Israel earlier in earlier attempts, and obviously targeting the U.S. militarily or diplomatically would be would invite a different type of response as well. What about what we've seen in the past, going after other regional targets? So the Gulf states and the like. How likely do you see that?
I don't see it as likely in the early going. One of the things the Israelis did not hit was their economic infrastructure, their oil infrastructure. And I
Right.
suspect they held that back because they're saying, okay, you hit certain kinds of targets here, we have that option to do that. Iran has always sort of said, if we can't export oil, no one's going to export oil. So I think they will hold that off. I also think they'll be very careful about not going after us. If it looks like this is only Israel, as it turns out, that's bad enough from an Iran standpoint. But if they provoke the U.S. into joining the Israelis in an offensive way, not only a defensive way, here again, I think the Supreme Leader, who's I think caught in kind of a vice, he's not going to want to get into a shooting war with the United States right now, given what I think he fears could be the consequence of that for the regime.
And
So
Kevin, if I might
Emily,
add as
yeah.
well, I think just one other factor to watch here is that obviously for a long time, Iran has been able to lean on proxies who have been significantly weakened in the region. Obviously, the US included has put in significant effort to weaken Houthi abilities. The Lebanese state overnight has warned Hezbollah not to get involved. That doesn't mean that they won't. Obviously, we are seeing a Lebanese state that's become slightly more assertive, but I think these are certainly variables to watch, and it raises the stakes in terms of miscalculations, strikes on assets that Iran may not have wanted to hit. And so I think that's kind of the one of the wild cards at the moment that we'll need to keep an eye on.
I agree with that, by the
And
way. I think this is, even if you don't want something to be the case, something can be set in motion where what you don't intend takes place anyway.
Emily, let's talk about market and commercial implications here. Dennis brought up the deliberate avoidance of hitting oil infrastructure in Iran. Nevertheless, as you could expect, oil markets responded very quickly and actually spiked quite significantly overnight, at least in its initial move. We saw sort of the biggest move since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've come off somewhat since then. And I imagine, so talk a little bit about oil markets. I know obviously that there's plenty of spare capacity in OPEC Plus right now, but nonetheless, 20 plus million barrels a day do pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the price movement we've seen in the last few hours says quite a lot. Prices were sitting comfortably in this mid 50 per barrel range, which seemed, reasonable given the sheer volumes that were coming on from non-OPEC and unwinding of output cuts from OPEC at the moment. They bounced to about the low 70s, but I think that tells a lot, compared to where we were a few years ago about how much room there is to run there. They didn't go higher because of the fact that, as we've said, these OPEC plus cuts are unwinding right now. There's a lot of spare capacity there. Certainly, there's going to be concern about whether this expands to start hitting regional infrastructure, further impacting shipping. We know that when the Iranians are cornered, one of their favorite things to do is try to block Strait of Hormuz. So I think these are all things that are on the table where we could see prices run much higher. But you're looking at a Trump administration that still wants very low oil prices. You're looking at the Saudis who are and the UAE and many other sort of key OPEC players who are keen to return more barrels to the market. So there's a lot at stake for Iran in pursuing those targets. So I think, we're probably still at a comfortable oil price range, and I wouldn't expect to see sort of significant shift beyond that low 70 per barrel mark for the time being.
And obviously, as we head into a weekend, when you have an action like this, generally speaking, overall the market goes risk off, and we are seeing that in equity, treasury, and gold markets as an example. But in terms of the economy, Emily, just one other question here for you is, clearly some of the Gulf states in particular have been diversifying their economies and in ways that are more highly dependent on global engagement, tourism, sporting events, the like. How does this kind of, especially if we go into a prolonged period here, impact some of those initiatives and the, economic objectives of those states?
Yeah, I've just spent a month in the region. You've seen sort of immense growth and change in the last few years. The Gulf states have really gone out of their way to keep an arm's length from this conflict. I think there's certainly a fear that if things expand, if there's miscalculation, this is certainly going to impact investor perception. I would not say right now that this is an immediate threat to these economic diversification plans, but this is certainly something that if the US gets drawn in, if this sort of escalates beyond kind of the immediate scope, that's a considerable risk, yes.
Okay, final question for both of you. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but while Teneo will be issuing research as needed, just kind of your sense of what to expect, what people ought to be thinking about over the next 72 hours, let's say through the weekend and into early next week. Dennis, what are your thoughts on that front?
Look, I think the critical thing to watch is there a ballistic missile barrage by Iran against Israel? How much damage are they able to inflict? One shouldn't assume the damage will be minimal. On the night of October 1st, they fired 200 ballistic missiles, 12-minute early warning time, 18 misfired, and 182 did not. 36 penetrated into Israel. Now, some of those were allowed to penetrate because they weren't hitting strategic areas or populated areas. But the fact is, you had 20% actually penetrate. And that was when there was a significant American presence out in the region to try to help. So a lot, we should see what happens with the kind of barrage that I expect is going to take place at some point. If it has some effect, then that's likely to trigger additional Israeli responses. And then I'm not saying this is uncontrollable, but you have a different kind of dynamic at play. The greater the damage in Israel, the more certainty that they will try to do that much more within Iran. So I would say in the next 72 hours, watch to see what the Iranians are able to do in terms of firing their ballistic missiles at Israel.
Anything you'd add to that?
That's perfectly well said. I think that's the key thing that we're looking at the moment.
Well, Dennis Ross and Emily Stromquist, thank you for joining me this morning. For those of you on the line, thanks for joining as well. And if you have any questions or would like to follow up, please contact your Teneo representatives or contacts, or you can reach us directly at teneoinsights@teneo.com. Thank you very much. I'm Kevin Kajiwara. Have a great day.